Okay, everyone, a little bit of change in the programming, but that's okay. We have Aizhamal, Nurmamat, kyzy, and Riona, MacNamara, Google.
Thank you. We're going to be talking about building documentation with empathy.
Exactly. Yes, I want to give a quick introduction of myself. My name is Aizhamal. The pronunciation gets confusing, but it's Aizhamal. So I'm an open source contributor. I'm part of Apache Beam and Apache Airflow community, and I'm from Kyrgyzstan. And if you're wondering where is the country, it's here. I put a reference. Yes, it's a teeny tiny country in Central Asia. So I focus on improving contributor experience in my team. I help other Googlers and non-Googlers to help them. And I also advocate for good documentation and non-code contribution. And
I'm Riona MacNamara. I am on the open source doc strategy team. My name is spelled R-I-O-N-A, but I like to say that it's pronounced Nav. So I work on open source documentation strategy at Google, and although I've been about a quarter century in technical communication and documentation, I've actually only been about a year in open source, so it's been an interesting year for sure. And one of the things we've been working with recently is looking about community and growing community contributions within open source, because I think we all know in this community that open source draws its strength from its people. It is the diversity of perspective and accountability of open source that makes individual projects stronger and that builds this ecosystem. But the truth is that getting started with open source is scary, and you can see this because one of the things that's so important about vibrant communities is that it is the most important thing that people look at when evaluating a project for adoption. Leah talked about this in her keynote, and from Digital Oceans you can see that the active community is actually even more important when choosing to adopt a community than the actual popularity of the project. But one of the challenges that we have is that, and everybody here knows this, is that the user base is not anything like the contributor base. And in fact, often the diversity and inclusion in open source is worse than diversity and inclusion in proprietary. I think based on the GitHub, the open source survey, although women make up, I think, about 23% of professional programmers, they only made up about 3% of respondents. And while men and women are about equally interested in contributing to open source projects, actually the people who actually contribute are much smaller. Women do and contribute at a much lower rate. And for most underrepresented groups, the picture is pretty grim of that as well. And that's actually even a problem on a bigger scale, because having an open source portfolio and a track record of contributions is becoming really important in entering and getting a career in technology. So that the more people who can contribute to open source, the stronger and the better those communities get, but also the industry in general. The truth is that contributing to open source can be pretty scary. It requires putting ourselves out there and making ourselves vulnerable. And one of the challenges that people have and the community have is that it can be very hard to get the knowledge that you need. The knowledge that you need in order to adopt a technology and to use it and absolutely to start contributing to it. It's a very challenging point of view. And so we thought that it was very important to understand how people got knowledge. We felt that documentation is key. Earlier on this morning in his keynote, Bob talked about tribal knowledge and the Apache way. Tribal knowledge is bad, and one of the correlations for there to be tribal knowledge implies that there's an in-group or an out-group. And without access to this kind of information, it's very hard to contribute. And some of the challenges that you see is tribal knowledge. Another challenge that you see that I've seen forever is around the idea that you don't even need documentation, because all you need to do is read the code. This is a quote that I found on Quora. I've redacted the name because the idea is that you don't need documentation, you can just go read the code. Just like tribal knowledge assumes that you have access to the in-group and you're confident about getting in contact with people. This kind of idea that you can just read the code, you can spend a few months digging around in it, is really exclusive of people who actually don't have time to do this. They are not doing it for fun, they're doing it for a job and trying to actually get started developing. So we figured out we wanted to know how this information need, what can we do to support people throughout their journey in open source. And so we commissioned a study. We wanted to find out how can we attract contributors to open source projects. And Aizhamal is going to tell us about the study.
Yes, so thank you, Riona. So we wanted to we had a question, okay, how can we attract more contributions to open source? So we wanted to understand who are our users, what is their journey towards contribution, and most importantly, how we can support them at every stage of their journey. So we commissioned this study. We interviewed 18 participants that have been actively using open source software, and we sat down with them and asked about their feelings, their past experience and present experience of contributing to open source, what were the barriers and how they feel about it. And if they don't contribute, we ask, why don't you contribute? And so who are our users? In our study, we identified 4 open source personas. Those are curious, competent, convinced, and leader. And when we say persona, it's not one person, it's a group of people that think or feel the same way. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about each of them. So curious, but not confident. That's me. Right? My name is Parker. I'm curious about open source. I'm very enthusiastic about open source. I even want to contribute back. But I face a lot of internal barriers. I have severe imposter syndrome. I don't have much support. I don't know people who contribute to open source. So what I ask, please hold my hand and show me how it is done. Show me how to do my first GitHub PR. How do I open my Jira account? Where should I go? Everything from the very beginning. And then we have competent but not convinced persona. They're relatively self-confident. They contribute mostly bug fixes, and they're fairly engaged in the community. They have sent a couple of emails, but they're not quite sold on the value of contributing to open source. They have a lot of mistrust and skepticism towards project owners, and what they're saying is convince me, what is the value of my contribution? Show me, show me. And then we have convinced but held back persona. They know the value of contributing, both code and non-code, and they have done a couple of times in the past. They know the project well, they feel safe in the community, but still they can't contribute. Why? Because they don't have time to convince, they don't have resources to convince their employers on value of contribution. So what they say, help me convince my employers of the value of contributing to open source. Provide me with the tools to become open source ambassador in my community. And the fourth person is leader, who contributes beyond code, and they provide mentorships. They collaborate with other open source leaders. They're well supported by their managers at work, but they also they want more tools to convince other business units and other teams of value of open source and value of contributing. So what they want, tools to scale. And So these are the 4 open source personas, and as you can see, they're at different stages of involvement with open source, and we also wanted to understand each of their journey towards contribution and understand which are the transition points and document them. So we, in our study, we found that contribution journey consists of 3 main steps. First, users gain exposure and familiarity with the project. Then they experience an external trigger that pushes them for contribution. And finally, act of contribution. So once users adapt and become more and more familiar with the project, they start understanding how it works, they get more comfortable as users of the open source software. Then it may happen that they run into bug in the software, or they think of feature that might be so useful for someone, and that's actually the trigger that pushes them to think of contributing. So when they experience the trigger, we found that many users actually don't think of contributing back until they experience this trigger, and even when they start thinking of contributing, the biggest barrier is they don't feel safe, they are afraid of asking the wrong question or being shamed publicly. And let's say they overcame that barrier and actually decided to contribute. So when someone writes a fix or patch for the project and they offer that in the mailing list and start discussion, they put themselves out there and they're vulnerable. And at this point, project maintainers, they could actually, this is where they can provide the most valuable support of being nice to them and acknowledging their contribution. And yes, so this was their journey towards contribution, and the question is how we, community members and project maintainers, how we can support them at every stage of their journey. And from here, I will let Riona speak.
Thank you. The single biggest thing that came out of the survey, and the single blocker, is going back to the fact that contributing and getting started is scary. And we saw this not just with new contributors, we saw it even with experienced contributors as they went. And people are required to make themselves vulnerable. Even things like asking a question in a page. Sure, we can have a friendly, well-moderated community, but even just asking it is scary. It is impossible to overstate the value of a safe and welcoming community. The foundation is psychological safety, and we can help with this. One of it is obviously we can try and develop a culture where we are friendly and welcoming and answering questions, but a much better solution, and one that is more accessible to people who are not always comfortable approaching people with requests, is to provide clear, comprehensive documentation that explains the project's organization and governance and its processes and its code. And even more importantly, and this was touched on earlier, reach out and encourage people to make contributions. For example, by suggesting great first issues. And this is where new contributions are really welcome, because you may be a brand new contributor. You can bring something really valuable to the community because you can see you are new. You see things that other people may be too familiar with to observe. And this is an idea of we can create a welcoming culture, not only by providing the information that they need, but also by reaching out and soliciting contributions from people and encouraging those contributions. So as people go through their journey, and I want to move quickly through that, but as Aizhamal talked about, the first thing when you're assessing a project, you want to know, is the project a technical fit? Is it actively maintained? Is support use cases. And we can support this kind of technical decision making with great docs that really make it clear what the project does, what are the use cases, the languages, the requirements, and we can also provide information that enables somebody to go to their management or their team and says, these are the legal implications of using this software. They can do that. And we can also, remembering the constraints that people are under, make sure that this information is really easily discoverable and is clear and consistent. And then when people are actually using the code, that is where people need what we think of as more straightforward technical documentation. They need to have code labs, tutorials, troubleshooting information, and very importantly, architecture overviews, because before you contribute to a project, you need to know how the code fits in to the overall image of the overall structure of the project. A well-maintained set of documentation is also one of the key indicators of project health. People look, is the documentation comprehensive, is it accurate, and is it maintained? And that's extremely important. And when we're looking at contributions, users really need, as we talked about, psychological safety is really important. If they're afraid to reach out or to talk to people, we need to make sure that the support they need is available and that the guidance that they need. And we need a culture where project maintainers are supportive and reach out. And that means that we need documentation that really clearly outlines what the contribution process is. This is what you can expect. And we also need to be able to support guidelines for maintainers. Here's ways that you can actually support your community. And here's how you can reach out, solicit contributions, and create this safe, welcoming environment for people to contribute to your docs, to your project. And as a summary, the kind of documentation that we need, it really falls into three buckets. We need documentation that clearly describes the project, its use cases, what the project is for, and how it can be used. And this is used when you're deciding whether to adopt something. You need traditional documentation that really clearly outlines the code, how you use it, how you implement it, how you get it unstuck. And we need very clear documentation around the community and the contribution process. And this should make it clear how you can get started and also what you can expect from it. So that's the kind of documentation we need. But what does that documentation look like, Aizhamal?
So we, in our study we found, probably you already know that documentation is so important, right? But what are the qualities of good documentation, how they should look like? So we asked them questions, okay, what are the characteristics, right? So they have to satisfy these needs. They need to have, they need to help users orient, they need to help users to dig in, and also documentation needs to follow basic information design principles. We talked about first two, but I want to dig into basic information design for documentation. Okay, so our participants, they emphasize that actually navigation is a major component of good documentation. The documentation needs to be findable, it needs to be scannable, legible, readable, sequential, and searchable. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that our respondents pointed us at, where they think they did a good job with documentation. So, findable. So, here it's a drzaurus.org. Their documentation, they have this rail table of content that outlines the depth and breadth of the documentation available. Also, it helps users orient themselves and understand the architecture of the documentation itself. And the navigation labels are descriptive and very easy to understand. There are no jargons. They provide context for users. This is, and another thing is scannable. So for users, it's it's very important that documentation includes visually distinct references to code, to narrative text, to code snippet, to variables, and everything. So here, Vue.js, yes, they do a good job at highlighting the text and differentiating from code snippets, then highlighting the variables, etc. And also they have this very good left rail content. And another example is PyTorch. They say participants, they emphasize that after getting acquainted with a project and developing a basic understanding of it, they really need to dig into specifics. So Google is great for search, but however, if they're already inside the documentation, they need to have a way to search for the things for specific things, or find something that they have already seen in this website and they want to find that. And the ability to search in the docs is very important. And we have more examples that we can share later, if you reach out to us, but for the sake of time, I just added on the 3. And
so really it is if we want to grow our communities, and if we want strong, vibrant communities that really enrich our project, the most important thing is psychological safety. Users really need to feel safe and welcomed into the community. But once that is in place, knowledge is power. Good documentation that outlines a project's organization, its code, and its processes enables people to feel comfortable and familiar enough to contribute. Just as the Apache way says the decision-making should be done in the open, and that even if a decision is made in the hallway, it gets put onto the list and is available to everyone. Documentation is how we get tribal knowledge out of the heads of the in-group and makes it available to everybody. Finally, we do need to make it as easy as possible for people to contribute, and people in the organization, this is how we can do it. We can reach out with suggestions, rate first issues, as Leah was saying. We can be responsible and kind, but we can also provide really clear guidelines and expectations. It's also a slightly circular thing. Good documentation supports contributions. But to have good contribution, to good documentation, you need people to contribute to the docs. And that goes around, let's really foster and recognize non-code contributions. They are valuable, and new contributors and new community members are in a really great place to identify what is missing from the documentation and to contribute it. It is a really great way to start. A lot of the speakers here earlier, it's been really inspiring. We were talking about how diversity and inclusion enables our projects to grow. By having documentation, by putting information out of the heads of the in-group and making it accessible to everybody who is able to contribute, we're going to improve not only our communities and our projects, but the knock-on effect is actually much better. Even within the open source and for our projects, documentation is an incredibly powerful tool for equity and inclusion. But if you look at the importance of contributing to open source and its growing importance in getting entry and employment in technology in general, documentation becomes even more, because it becomes an agent of economic advancement. It enables people to take part in this technology, and it becomes an agent of social change. So it's really important, and let's focus on making the information available to technologists everywhere and making it a safe and delightful place to contribute. We went over time, I'm really sorry. Yeah.
So I think it's a loaded question. Do you preferred or favorite technology or formats for documentation? I asked that because I've seen, the coolest thing I've seen so far has been in some various Scala documentation. They automatically compile the code snippets that are in the documentation. to like validate that it compiles. I'm not sure if it actually runs that, but it at least verifies the syntax. Right? Like, do you have any sort of technology thing you work with that works pretty well with documentation?
There are a few things, and I have strong opinions about this. I think the most fundamental thing is that documentation should live as close to the code as possible. That for a whole lot of reasons, integrations are easier. We tend not to update documentation when they update code. If they live as close together as possible, you can do things like write code samples as unit tests that get built and tested and validated. You can do things like enable engineers to update the documentation using the same tool set and workflow that they use to update code. You can do it so that they can submit changes to documentation in the same PR that they are submitting changes to code. There's a few tool systems. Facebook's DocuSource, I think, is a really good system. It's a very simple markdown system. There's a lot of processes out there. Another one, we use Hugo a lot for our themes. I think fundamentally, there's other tools that are easier for some people to get on board with. You think about wikis and things like that. This is my personal opinion, strongly held, is that the further these things are from the code, the more the code will evolve and the docs will decay, and stale docs are probably worse than no docs or something. So I would say whatever is the simplest for people to do, whatever is the simplest for people to use to create and maintain using their existing workflow and focus. Does that answer your question?
I think it sits on screen reader friendly stuff. Like, if you've done a survey of Apache projects, and are there anything that you would say we should look at?
With regard to screen reader, I actually don't know about that, but there are basic accessibility guidelines that everybody should be following, right? Things like strong headings, consistent headings, alt text, proper diagrams, all that kind of things. And certainly there should be guidelines in place. This is incredibly important. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.